Hi, everyone. Let's give everyone a few minutes to get the right link and log on, but thank you for being here. Everyone, we're just going to wait just a couple of minutes and make sure everyone gets a chance to log on. We'll start maybe in 2 minutes. If you're just hopping on now, we're going to wait just 1 or 2 more minutes and then we'll begin. Thank you. I want to make sure everyone has a chance to get on. All right, let's get started with this session. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning. My name is Judy Margles. I'm the director of the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. I just have the great delight to introduce the session and then moderate some questions. But I'm really glad that everyone is joining us for what is an extremely important session, uncovering hidden aspects of Islamophobia in Oregon and beyond. Many experts agree that the United States will become a country without a specific ethnic or racial majority by the year 2050. Think about that. Less than 30 years from now. And of course, some of us welcome this growing diversity. Others see it as a demographic threat. And they are the ones intent on eroding the rights of historically marginalized and minority groups, including American Muslims. In Oregon and elsewhere, this hate and prejudice Muslims face has often been articulated as a defense of such liberal values as democratic principles, religious tolerance, and women's rights. So what we're going to talk about today is the way that these values foster suspicion and fear of outsiders. And we're looking at this through the lens of regulatory and disciplinary role that they play in the Muslim community in the greater Portland area. Our speaker is also going to uncover some of the ways that these communities have experienced prejudice as they sought to establish mosques and Islamic schools. We're really delighted that Tehniyat Naveed is with us today. Tehniyat worked on the Portland Muslim History Project archive in 2018. This was a project that cataloged the history and development of the local Muslim community. She's a graduate of Reed College with a double major in psychology and religion. And her religious thesis, Religion and Land Use, Islamic Institutions in Oregon, found that the local mechanisms of integration were set up in ways that are potentially harmful to minorities. This will form the basis of her talk today. We're gonna have time for questions at the end, so please put your questions in the Q&A and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Welcome, Tehniyat. So glad to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Judy. Hi, everyone. My name is Tehniyat Naveed. I'm going to be talking about hidden aspects of Islamophobia in Oregon today. This was the subject, as Judy said, of my undergraduate thesis. The way that this talk is structured is in 3 parts. Before I begin our discussion on Islamophobia, I think it's important to underscore the history behind religious freedom in the United States. And this history is going to inform our understanding of how it's worked for religious minorities. Then we will narrow our focus to Muslims in Oregon, how they first established their institutions, how they informed their presence in the state. And then finally, we're going to discuss the discrimination that Muslims faced when they were building these religious institutions in Oregon, and how this process of institution building actually allows for discrimination to occur. Finally, we're going to open the floor for some questions and we can have a discussion. So the First Amendment of the Constitution states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So that is the Establishment Clause, and the other one is the Free Exercise Clause. So this means essentially that the government cannot establish a favored religion, and it cannot prohibit the free exercise of religion. And if you notice, they're known as the religion clauses, and there's an inherent tension between these two clauses, because how can you prevent the prohibition of free exercise unless you have a preconceived or established notion of what religion is in the first place? So a good example illustrating this tension is that although the United States has not established Christianity or anything as an official religion, the Pledge of Allegiance states, one nation under God, and the currency states, in God we trust, and so on. The extent to which the First Amendment protects the freedom of religion has been contested, and I will show that using the following examples. So Reynolds v. United States in 1878, this was one of the first cases that dealt with the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. So George Reynolds was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and he was charged with bigamy because he tried to marry a woman while he was already married. He stated that his religion required him to marry multiple women, and so the law violated his First Amendment right to free exercise of religion. But the Supreme Court ruled that the federal anti-bigamy statute did not violate the free exercise clause. They also stated that laws are made for the government of actions, and while they cannot interfere with mere religious belief and opinions, they may interfere with practices. And then this was a very seminal case when it came to discussing how the free exercise of religion is prohibited when it comes to religious minorities. It is known as Employment Division v. Smith, and this occurred in 1990. So 2 Native American counselors were fired from a private drug rehabilitation organization because they ingested peyote, which is a powerful hallucinogen, as part of a religious ceremony. So they were later denied unemployment benefits because they were fired for work-related misconduct. The Supreme Court ruling found that the free exercise clause does not excuse compliance with neutral and generally applicable laws. So that means applying to everyone, and neutral in that they're not favoring one religion or over another. So they also, the state of Oregon, they said that they were justified to prohibit the sacramental use of peyote by Native American individuals under a neutral and generally applicable criminal statute. So both these cases illustrate how these preconceived notions about religious behavior, which are established through Christianity, when the government remains neutral in these cases related to religion, it becomes harmful for religious minorities. So the Smith decision resulted in a lot of public outcry. There was outrage, and critics claimed that this stripped away protections for religions and subverted First Amendment standards. So as you can see in the picture, bipartisan support led to Congress passing the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993. This is a good example of how historical processes have been used to adjust the laws in recognition of religious diversity and religious plurality. And most notably, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act provided all religious individuals and institutions with a claim or a defense when state or federal governments burdened their religious exercise, even if the burden resulted from a law of general application. Now, this is very relevant to what we're talking about today. It's important because land use and zoning laws are considered neutral and generally applicable. And the next case is going to illustrate a classic conflict between religious institutions and laws of general application, meaning they apply. So this is the city of Bernie v. Flores, 1997. This happened only 4 years after the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was enacted. And in this case, the Archbishop of San Antonio sued local zoning authorities for violating his rights under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And he said that they were denying him a permit to expand his church in Bernie, Texas. Zoning authorities argued that the church was located in a historic preservation district, and it was governed by an ordinance forbidding the expansion. So they declared that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was unconstitutional when it applied to states, because the state had more power over the federal government in this instance. So the Supreme Court then ended up ruling that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was unconstitutional because it sought to override the local preservation ordinance, and they invalidated the RFRA as it applied to states. So then the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act of 2000 was Congress's response to striking down the striking down of the RFRA in 1997. So RLUIPA, for short, sought to protect the free exercise of religion from excessive governmental interference while preventing discrimination suffered by religious individuals and groups when it came to land use specifically. So RLUIPA provides religious institutions with, just like the RFRA did, with a claim or a defense when government action substantially burdens religious exercise. So from this brief history, we can understand that we've also found that the RLUIPA has been criticized because people claim that it establishes or favors religious institutions over non-religious institutions when it comes to land use. But we have found through our examples that we have when you have a preconceived notion of what constitutes a religion in the first place, religious minorities are the ones that suffer. And while these religion clauses were enacted to ensure religious freedom for minorities, they're also inadvertently, they're defining what is religion. They're defining which religion and what kind of religion can be free. So the liberalization of US immigration laws in 1965 allowed more Muslims to become a part of the diverse American religious landscape. And in 2018, as Judy was saying before, I worked on this archive known as the Portland Muslim History Project. And the objective of that archive was to archive this, to record the history and development of the local Muslim community in Oregon. And there's a link to the archive here. I'm not sure if you guys can click on it. And it's a great resource, and you can find interviews, pictures, videos spanning over a decade, which record the stories of how the Muslim community in Oregon first came and where they were moving, where they located. And while I was working for this archive, I came across documents that detailed the institution building process for these communities. And these were collected for the original project. So while I was compiling them, I found these documents very interesting because there were clear signs of blatant discrimination in formal and legal settings. And these went on to become the primary sources for my thesis. Before we continue, I think it's important if we have a working definition of Islamophobia. The Runnymede report from 1997 defines Islamophobia as unfounded hostility towards Islam, practical consequences of such hostility in unfair discrimination against Muslim individuals and communities, exclusion of Muslims from mainstream political and social affairs. I think this definition is still pretty relevant today, and it would be good to keep this definition in mind going forward so we can see exactly how Muslims were made to feel excluded in the social sphere in Oregon. So in the process of land use and zoning, because it took me a while to figure this out as well, so I'm going to give a very brief overview of it. A zoning amendment proposal is presented to several governing bodies at different times before it can be approved. And at each stage of this process is open to the public. So if the community opposes an establishment, they can voice their opinion. If they support an establishment, they can voice their opinion. This is all recorded. So this clearly allows for dialogue to take place through which the neighborhood and the Muslims could hypothetically reach common ground. However, what we find is in practice, it may allow for conflict to play out and further exacerbate the divide between communities. While it makes the Muslims more visible and it shows their intention to integrate into the neighborhood, this visibility also allows them to it opens them up to discrimination and hate from certain members of the community. So one of the ways in which they express their feelings of exclusion, of wanting to exclude Muslims from the community, is through this concept called livability. So here is a definition of livability that helped me understand it's a very broad term, so it helped me understand the broad scope of the term. Livability takes the following three matters into account: quality, use, and maintenance, management of dwellings, facilities, and public space. Similar views of residents on important housing style components, which coincide with natural internalized lifestyles, and those physical and social characteristics of the neighborhood which residents want to be associated with, and which in the eyes of those concerned inspire confidence in the future. So it's like a neighborly, it's a very social kind of integration into the neighborhood. They're accounting for all kinds of things like noise, pollution, traffic. So the way in which livability, is negotiated in these legal processes permits the governing authority to deem Muslim institutions as livable or appropriate for their neighborhoods. However, the problem arises when the neighborhood is able to attempt to exclude Muslim institutions through these very same processes. So by arguing against the feasibility of an institution in the community, the neighborhood is able to articulate a case against the integration of Muslims. And we can find this in the quotes ahead. So here's a quote I took from a petition against the expansion of Masjid al-Sabr, and it had around 15 signatures on it. And this was in 1995. This building would not conform to the neighborhood of nice homes for families with children. A church is open for everyone. The mosque is for Muslims only. And then the next two slides, these two slides contain quotes from handwritten letters to the planning commissioner regarding this expansion. Sorry, my face is here. It would not be conforming to our neighborhood of nice homes for families with children. These people that want this mosque aren't neighborly or socially oriented. So you see they're trying to exclude them by saying like they don't want to be a part of this community. They're not social, they're not neighborly. It's not like a church, which is acceptable. And then, why a mosque in our peaceful neighborhood? Would you like to live near one? This mosque is not built to accommodate permanent people like the rest of churches are for. We don't need it here in our neighborhood. So another way in which these sort of comments of hate or discrimination are expressed is through issues of parking and traffic. However, I should say that these kinds of issues are prevalent in non-religious institutions, religious institutions, both, but it's just brought up in a way, the neighbors use these same considerations and evaluations of parking and traffic to express their fear of Muslims, and that's going to be very evident in the slides ahead. It would cause more crime. It would cause more crime with the added traffic and the parking of strangers in front of houses. The area is already among the highest in most crime statistics. There are additionally many young children in this neighborhood, and the male foot traffic to and from the mosque would be disquieting to the neighborhood. This is their characterization. I wonder about their driving ability and the safety of other pedestrians. If parking on Capitol Highway would be permitted, that endangers anyone seeking clearance to get out from side streets to go either direction. So throughout this building process, these processes offer the neighborhood methods through which they can challenge the Muslim community under the pretense of mutual concerns about public space. So they can say, oh, it's the noise. They can say it's the noise, it's the safety measure, it's the parking, it's the traffic. So they're trying to express their feelings of hate, but they're doing it in a way that's acceptable to the local governing authority as well, by saying, oh, we can equate them with unlivable standards. So the community is unlivable, as I mentioned before. So these neutral tools can veil Islamophobia and xenophobia and it can drive their attempts to frustrate the Muslims' integration process. And the issue with the formal proceedings is that they're allowed in a way that they're set up in a way that allows for this discrimination to occur. So the documents also revealed that despite intense opposition and rejection, Muslims have been able to establish their own institutions. So this shows that the tools through which neighborhoods can frustrate this integration process, it does not completely eradicate Muslim agency. Neutrality does not allow religious minorities to thrive. However, it does allow for the religious majority to establish its own understanding of religion. The issues discussed in this presentation are not unique to Oregon alone. They're also not unique to Muslims alone. But it's important that we understand how these civic processes are experienced by minority communities so that we can understand how subtle or not so subtle discrimination is lived on a day-to-day basis. So like religious freedom and freedom of expression, these are great ideals, but not everyone experiences them in the same way. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm actually a little speechless and stunned looking at the correspondence that you showed us. And it really reminds me of a similar situation in the Jewish community when the Oregon Holocaust Memorial was being cited, and our archives at the Jewish Museum are actually full of not dissimilar statements on the part of residents in the nearby neighborhoods, fearful of this memorial and what it would attract. So thank you for that. I mean, just really a fascinating way of looking at discrimination that we might not normally think about. I've had a little bit in my mind because of that experience, but, and please everyone do put your questions in the Whova chat, which we're gonna try and figure out how to get to. I'm sure we can, so thank you. Amber, our tech person who's behind the scenes is helping moderate here, so thank you. I really appreciated that you're looking at these local stories, right? And why are local stories important to understand religious discrimination? And any particular examples that you didn't give in your presentation that you might want to share to sort of dig deeper into local stories?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of these, so my thesis specifically focused on subtle forms of discrimination. It didn't even, a lot of these quotes I didn't even use in my thesis because when there's overt Islamophobia, you can kind of identify it. But what I also wanted to look at, for example, there was the expansion of the MET school. They wanted to expand the school in.
I'll just interrupt you quickly and say MET is Muslim Education Trust for people.
Oh, yeah, sorry, the Muslim Education Trust. They wanted to expand, I think it was in 2000 or something. And they were faced with a lot of comments saying that like, how large are your wall? How high are your walls going to be, for example? And then people would say that, they would say that it's going to be a wooden wall or vinyl, and it's going to be 8 feet high, which is the highest that is allowed. But then members of the community said that they want a wall that's higher than 8 feet and they want it to be concrete. And so stuff like that makes you think that there is overt discrimination in this, but there's also this subtle forms of discrimination of like, we don't want to see you. We don't want you to integrate as part of this community. And when we look at these local stories, it shows how this discrimination is lived by Muslims, like how they're experiencing it. And I'm sure this is also, by the way, like I wanted to bring up, like it's true for every community, every minority community, they're going to face this kind of hate, they're going to face this kind of discrimination. When you look, I would be interested, I think, to compare it to the majority to see, so Oregon's majority was Protestant. So I wonder if a Protestant church, for example, would have the same kind of hateful comments or the same amount of hateful comments versus comments in support.
And why do you think in the correspondence that you showed, there were so many comparisons to churches? And there's actually a comment that came through in a question, and I also picked up on it as well. is this significant? Like, why these comparisons with churches, or these somewhat uninformed comparison with churches? How can you explain?
So I think one thing is interesting, that even in the formal documents towards for the local governments, they also said your church is going to be this big, or the proposed church is. So it's interesting that it's also the only term that they can understand it in is a church. I would also like to say that these are a little bit older, these documents that I was looking at. So maybe it's back then they were referring to it as a church because that's the only way that they could understand it, because that's the way that the majority perceives religion is, oh, it's Christian, it's a church. But what was interesting was that it goes the other way as well, that the neighborhood that does advocate for churches but not mosques, they're also thinking in those terms. And they're thinking, oh, well, how is this different from a church? Will I be allowed in it? Will I not? Was it exclusionary? And I think that's really important because of the way that the US conceptualizes religion in their constitution, even, is that, sorry, they're looking at it as a church. And sorry, I just got a comment from someone saying, to this day, the majority of my Christian friends, it disappeared.
Oh, refer to Beth Israel
as my church.
as
So
well.
it's conceptualization of it's a religious institution. It must be like a church, or is it different to a church, or how similar is it? Should I be scared of it?
Yeah. So just going back a little bit, how did you come to this idea of looking at municipal zoning laws? How did you understand that it really was an avenue to uncover ways to understand the ability of the Muslim community to create religious institutions?
So I think one of the things that I was really inspired by while I was working on the Portland Muslim History Project was that these communities they were very small communities, and then when they wanted to build their religious institutions, they did build them at the end. I think I was just startled by how much hatred and how much discrimination and prejudice they had to face to go through this. But what was the most startling to me when I was archiving these documents was that it was allowed in such a formal legal setting. They were allowed to say things like this, and it wasn't, no one said, you can't say that, or anything like that. Obviously, the time was also very different back then, but it was still very interesting to see that even in these formal processes, like municipal zoning, you wouldn't expect anything discriminatory to be going on in such a neutral, quote unquote neutral environment. But when I found these instances in zoning, I figured that this would be an interesting avenue to explore, because it's not something that people usually look at and think this is Islamophobic.
Right. I mean, you had said earlier that land use laws are considered to be neutral, and in
Exactly.
research you're finding out they aren't. So was the language concretized in the zoning laws, or these were just citizen voices choosing to interpret these laws in ways that worked to their advantage?
I don't know if I could say like how the citizens were thinking about it. I just know that they were the language of the hearings officer, planning officer, those were very neutral. But at the same time, they did allow for the community to have their input in it and say that, oh, does this mean they're unlivable? Does this mean they're too noisy? If they're too noisy, we don't want them here. So they were looking at the specific categories that they could use counter against or to make an argument against Muslim integration into their neighborhood. Right. So I would say that it's not that these laws themselves are discriminatory. They're just set up in ways that allows for discrimination to occur.
Right. It's an age-old tactic, right? I mentioned the siting of the Oregon Holocaust Memorial, but I'm also reminded about redlining, which was something that went on around the country. Was it ever written into the laws? Of course not. So I don't know whether you have anything to suggest about the comparison with redlining. So redlining, for anyone who doesn't know, was the was the way that realtors and bankers sort of banded together to, sort of impose boundaries on neighborhoods where they didn't want people they didn't want to live in their neighborhoods. In Portland, it was to block people. It's been used to keep other people out as well. But these sort of, they're kind of sophisticated. They're not concretized in law, of course, and regrettably they work. Because, so were there any, maybe that does lead to the question with, with the 3 institutions that you were looking at, MET and the 2 mosques, did they have trouble getting funding? Do you know? Was, sort of the situation sort of across the board, getting bankers to work with them on mortgages and this sort of thing?
I don't have enough information to say concretely if they did or didn't. I do know that when I was doing research for this project, for my thesis, I was looking into the treatment of Catholic Christians. I was looking at the treatment of Catholics, at the treatment of Jews, at the treatment of Black people in Oregon. And historically, I would say with Black people, it was written in the law that they were not allowed to live there for the longest time. And then even when they were, it didn't make a difference because they were still facing so much pressure from around their neighborhood to move. For example, there was a Dr. Unthank, who first came in, and he moved like 4 times before he was moved out of the neighborhood. And so, sorry, I went off track over there for a second, but I think even with Jews, it was with Jewish people, it was the same. They were facing a lot of discrimination, like their synagogues were vandalized when they first came here. But I don't think, for Muslims, it wasn't written in the legislation that they weren't allowed to live here, or there weren't any explicit sort of laws that were against their integration. It was just they just faced this discrimination, but I guess it makes it better that it wasn't written in the laws that they're not allowed to have funding, that they're not allowed to have any of these. But I think, yeah, I don't think it was, not to my knowledge.
Here, I'm just going to read you this question. How have laws created to protect religious freedom of minorities been wielded against these very freedoms? And you talked a little bit at the beginning about this, but it might be good to hear something more if you have examples, and how any examples you might offer might be meaningful to help us understand this practice of interreligious freedoms and the unintended consequences that they might carry.
So the question is like, how are laws that are created to protect religious freedom subvert it?
Yeah, how have in your research or whatever you think, how have they backfired to work?
I think because when you define what religious freedom is, it wasn't completely neutral in the way that they defined it as well, because initially these laws came about because there were a lot of different denominations that were majority religions in different states in America. For example, Oregon was Catholic, Oregon was Protestant, and some states were Catholic. And so they didn't want to give one favor or over another. So they decided that all of them are created equally. But in all of this, they didn't take into account, for example, Native American religions. They didn't take into account Muslims. And also that's probably because Muslims, although there were Muslims in the United States before the liberalization of immigration laws, they didn't really have these minority religions in mind. So the laws are already created in a way that kind of favor Christianity. But at the same time, like they are still created in a way that you can sort of go back to your First Amendment right and say, I do have the right to freely exercise my religion. The issue just becomes that sometimes you exercising your religion just goes against seemingly neutral laws. Or seemingly neutral laws, or even criminal statutes. So for example, ingesting peyote or bigamy. I know there's another case, Sherbert v. Werner, where an individual was fired from her job because she refused to work on a Saturday, and she was a Seventh-day Adventist. And then she was denied unemployment benefits because they said, well, you could just work on a Saturday. And she said, it's literally against my religion. So she did win that case. So it's just that sometimes it takes political processes for your case to go forward, as happened with Employment Division v. Smith. Sometimes it takes a little bit more public outcry and more support from the public, where they sort of have to help you in your cause. But in most cases, what I found is the minority religion kind of, and it's not even because the laws are created without them in mind, but it's just they're created with Christianity in mind, or with a majority religion in mind. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's good. And if anybody wants to, dig further in that, just put your question in the Huva, or if you can get into the Zoom chat, do that too. So we know there are a number of mosques in Portland that have been successfully established, and your research talked about 2 of them. So how did those establishing these mosques, how did they overcome the neighborhood resistance? And can you talk a little bit about strategies they used to be?
That I don't want to speak for these mosques, but just from what I gathered while I was working for the Portland Muslim History Project, some of these mosques kind of internalized these comments, and they didn't really practice in a lot of interfaith activities. So I know, for example, post 9/11, a lot of these mosques, they opened up their doors and they said that you are welcome to come in and learn about our religion. They practiced a lot of interfaith activities with different religions, like I think they also did with Judaism, for example. They had a lot of synagogues that they spoke to and they hosted these meetings with. And then, but certain communities, they did sort of stay within themselves, and they didn't really try to I don't know if I should say that, but they did. I don't think they tried to address these comments head on, but mostly it was through interfaith activities and sort of open doors, open houses, that they would try to spread the message that this is what Islam is about. This is what, yeah.
You just harkening back to this word neutral, these land use laws being neutral, and this is a question coming in. Are you saying, in our opinion, they were knowingly bigoted, racist, biased? I mean, so just thinking a little bit, help us understand these sort of neutral land use laws and the way that they were subjugated for the purposes of the people fighting against them.
Yeah. I don't think they were knowingly bigoted. I don't think they were knowingly racist.
So a very different practice. Redlining was very explicit, but
yes,
it was the people, and I'll get to another question about that, but sorry.
It's like, it's kind of like these laws are made with the majority in mind. For example, they're made with churches in mind, and they're not made to accommodate every single religious institution, for example. And I'm not expecting that they should be. I think there should just be a more comprehensive way in which they can handle these kinds of situations, or a way in which they don't open up the doors to this much. I don't have any recommendations that I can make. I just think that it's important to look at these local stories so we can see how sometimes inadvertently these can open the door for discrimination. But I'm not claiming that these neutral laws are racist and they were made by racists and they were made with racists in mind. Like, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that sometimes they can be used in that way. And I guess that is how the law has worked. Like, it can work as a weapon, it can work as a shield, it can work in both ways. Because these buildings were built at the end of the day. It's not like it hindered their religious freedom. But it was just a slightly more drawn out process than it would have been, I'm assuming, for a majority religion.
Right, and it does come back to this sort of the power of our voices as citizens, right? You've got these residents, suburban citizen groups, these people who really were able to sway the shaping of city regulations. And it's a positive opportunity, right? That me as a citizen of Portland, I can go to a city council meeting and state my position, right? But as you pointed out, it also fosters resistance to the building of institutions belonging to religious minorities. And as you've also pointed out, it's put these barriers into the integration of Islam into American life, right? It's giving resistant the ability to control and delimit institution building. I am sure, and you've alluded a little bit, but maybe say a little bit more of the way that non-Muslim communities have successfully allied themselves with the Muslim communities to bring about change. And what more can we do? Like what more can caring non-Muslim allies do to help integrate Muslim communities into American life?
I think it's always good to
Great.
I think it's always good to just, as a good practice, to ask the communities themselves how they would best be served, how they would best be helped. I know that this has happened a lot in the past, that when there were a lot of Islamophobic attacks, or post 9/11, there were a lot of Jewish lawyers who did help the Muslim community if they were wrongfully imprisoned or anything like that. And there has been that kind of allyship that's presented itself in the past. And but I don't think I can speak for a community and say like, this is exactly what they need. But I think it's just per community, like it's good to just even know that you have friends in the neighborhood, or you have people that are on your side because they've experienced, as I've shown, so much opposition, that having the same, like showing up at the same meetings and saying, we do want you here, or, you know, you are a permanent resident or something like that. I think that would be potentially helpful. And
in your research, you showed us these, you know, really kind of dismaying examples of citizen resistance. Were you able to look at wonderful examples of citizen affirmation of community building?
I think it was a long time ago, and I don't think I saw. So there was an overwhelming amount against, and this was also something that was brought up during these meetings. Like there were a lot of complaints to the hearings officer that how could you let this pass when there were 35 people speaking against it and only one in favor. So there's also those instances where the community was outraged that there was no one in support of these people, or only a limited amount of people in support of these institutions, and it still went through. They were still allowed to build, and their applications were approved. Unfortunately, I didn't find a lot of people coming together and saying, we do want a mosque here, we do want, it would be great to join us in this community. There was even one instance I remember where someone said that their wife was Muslim, but they didn't want their property values to go down. So it was a bit, you know, but it was also a different time. And I think in the world that we live in now, people are a lot more willing to step up and befriend the other, or the person they might be scared of or something.
You do believe that? You do think that if a mosque wanted to be cited in today, that there would be more support?
I think people are definitely at least more vocal now, and they're also more, I do think so. I think definitely they also know more about Muslims, and a product of what has happened in like the past, whatever has happened, like the Muslim ban or any of these things, like there's still a community of people that want to learn more and want to learn about what Islamophobia is or learn about what Islam really means. So I don't think it's all just a blanket, it's better or it's worse, but I think I have definitely seen at least more people interested in knowing what Islam is than when I was younger, for example. So I think there is a change.
Yeah. So a question from the chat which mirrors a question that I have. Do you think that Muslims in Oregon and America have secured religious freedom?
I think it depends on how you define religious freedom. Mm-hmm. But because if you define it just as, are you able to build your institution? Are you able to worship and pray in your institution? Are you able to hold your beliefs? Yes. And on a very surface level, they do have a space, they have a sacred space, they have a place where they can pray, they have a community. But I think if you define it as, I can't think at the top of it, if you define it as, but I think definitely it is, at the very least, they are able to build their institutions. Mm-hmm. At the very least, there are certain protections in place that they can refer to or use to protect them in the First Amendment, for example. So these are definitely ideals to aspire to, that everyone experiences religious freedom in the same way. I just think Muslims experience it a little differently. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And this past I keep calling it a 50-month year that we've all been living through, we're I think we're very aware in the uptick, of course, in Asian American discrimination, anti-Semitism. Are you able to just comment about any kind of change in Islamic discrimination since the pandemic? Has there been an uptick? I have to confess that I don't know. I don't know if you know what the situation has been with Muslims either in Oregon or in America. You want to just put it in the
Oregon specifically. I haven't been. I don't think I'm qualified to answer that. I don't know. But it's just off of my anecdotal evidence and what my experience has been. I don't think it's been to the same degree as other communities, for certain, like for Asian Americans or Black Americans. Like, I don't think it's been the same degree of, but also I could be completely wrong. I don't want to offend anybody by saying that as well. But that's just been my personal experience. Sorry. Yeah.
No, this has been absolutely wonderful. I think we're closing in at the end. If anybody has one last question they want to get in there, now is your time. If not, I think we're just going to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. It's an important way to think about how the insidiousness of discrimination, that it's not just someone confronting someone and being impossibly inappropriate and rude and offensive, violent. It occurs. I keep coming back to citizen voices. We all relish this opportunity to live in a democracy and use our voices, but clearly there are systems that allow our powerful voices to be used in ways that really do repress religious freedom. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for joining us. I think we're in for a huge treat next with Eric Ward speaking. So I think we'll end this session, give everyone a break, and Tehniyat, Naveed, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you, Amber. Oh, I think actually another question might just have come in. But... All right, we'll deal with it offline. Thank you, everyone. Bye.